Hi, I'm Larry Withers. For the serious artist, the study of human anatomy is undeniably important, and learning to properly render the body can be a lifetime quest. This program is intended to give the viewer a general knowledge about the human body as it relates to the artist. In this video, we will detail the bones of the skeleton, the major muscle groups, the surface features, and the visual landmarks of the body. For this video, we've divided the body into its natural divisions by general task. For instance, the shoulder and upper body, which are involved with the larger movements of the arm. The midsection, the abdomen, obliques, and back muscles, which allows the mass of the upper body to twist, bend, and holds the upper body erect. And the legs, which transports the body through our environment, and so forth. Segmenting the body in this way will make our study more manageable and allow us to see how the various sections integrate and function together. We'll also address the general mechanics of the body as well as male and female proportions. So with that, let's begin this exploration of the human form. There's a beautiful symbiotic relationship between the bones and the muscles of the body. The bones form the basic framework or structure which supports the muscles. The muscles, in turn, provide the power to move the body's skeletal structure. The body is composed of numerous mechanical devices such as the lever, the pulley, the ball and socket joint. But there's a distinct difference between a man-made machine, like an automobile, and the human machine. For example, cars depend on combustible power. The pistons explode, pushing or driving the powertrain, which in turn moves the car. In the case of the human body, the muscles are the power source. But instead of pushing, the muscles act upon the human machine by pulling, similar to how a marionette moves by pulling its strings. The elbow is perhaps the clearest demonstration of human mechanics. The joints, in this case the elbow, facilitate the movement. To initiate movement, the brain sends an electrical signal to the muscle. The muscle then begins to contract or gather itself towards the middle, which in turn pulls and raises the lower arm. When the muscle contracts, it appears to swell or enlarge. Almost every muscle in the body has its counterpart. For instance, the bicep raises the arm up, while the tricep, on the back of the arm, straightens the arm. When one muscle is working, the opposing muscle is working in some degree against the first muscle. The body has a limited range of motion, often dictated by the limitations of the joints. The head turns approximately 80 degrees in either direction, and the bony processes of the spinal column keep us from falling backward. The muscles of the body vary in size and shape, depending upon their position, function, and level of exertion. The muscles derive their names in various ways. The deltoid muscle comes from the Greek delta, which means 3. Delta describes the triangular shape of this muscle. The serratus magnus muscle looks like the serrated edge of a knife. Other naming conventions have to do with the muscle's position, function, and size. You'll notice the body's mechanical parts repeat themselves. For instance, the hip joint resembles the ball and socket of the shoulder. Both the knee and elbow are hinge joints. And the lower limb, like the forearm, is composed of 2 separate bones, which articulate with the wrist-like ankle joint and foot. If I could offer one suggestion to aid your study of human anatomy, it would be to memorize the bones. The bones are a constant. Their shape doesn't vary like muscles, and in a sense, the bones dictate the shape of the muscles and surface forms. Rules of proportion have evolved and changed since man began creating art. Often these rules have less to do with reality than popular ideals of beauty. Artists have historically used proportion where the figure stands anywhere from 8 to 9 heads tall. A head is a unit of measure, from the top of the skull to the bottom of the chin, and is a traditional unit of measure for artists. For our purposes, we'll use a more realistic measure, where the average adult height is 7.5 heads tall. Here are some common measurements associated with the human form. Each of these distances measures 1 head. From the chin to the line of the nipples, from the nipples to the navel, from the armpit to the point of the elbow, and the height of the buttocks. The distance from the sole of the foot to the bottom of the kneecap measures 2 heads. From the bottom of the kneecap to the point of the groin is also 2 heads in length. From the front, the distance from the top of the clavicle to the anterior point of the iliac crest measures 2 heads, while in the back, it's the distance from the spine of the 7th cervical to the top of the buttocks. The point of the elbow to the tip of the middle finger measures 2 heads, as well as the outside distance from shoulder to shoulder. There's a distance of 3 heads between the chin and the gluteal fold, as well as from the summit of the head to the navel, or as seen from the back, to the top of the buttocks. The arm, from the armpit to the end of the middle finger, is also 3 heads in length. Here are some other general measures. With arms outstretched, the distance from middle finger to middle finger is about equal to the height of the figure. From the center of the patella to the anterior superior iliac spine is the same distance as from the center of the patella to the ground. There are variances in proportion between men and women. Female legs are generally shorter in proportion to males. The same can be said for arm length of women. Women's hips are wider, and their shoulders and waist are more narrow than the male. These measurements and characteristics are not absolute, but are averages, and shouldn't be used as a substitute for careful observation by the artist. The axial skeleton can be considered the structural center post or armature of the human body. It's comprised of the spinal column and sacrum, which are situated on the hip bones, and the skull, which is seated at the top, and the rib cage. From this central structure radiates the extremities of the arms and the legs. The spinal column is made up of 24 separate drum-like bones or vertebrae, stacked one upon the other. These vertebrae can be divided into 3 groups. The topmost are the 7 cervical vertebrae, and they're dedicated to supporting and the movement of the head and neck. The dorsal or thoracic vertebrae are 12 in number, and they provide an attachment for the ribs. The lower 5 vertebrae make up the lumbar region, which rests upon the sacrum, a keystone-shaped bone which fits between the hip bones. Together, these vertebrae function as one highly flexible unit. Viewed in profile, the spinal column is S-shaped and its contours well worth memorizing. Artists will often incorporate the line of the spinal column to establish the gesture of the human form, making it an extremely important drawing aid. Each vertebrae also features processes or extensions, 2 laterally and 1 posteriorly, to which are attached the muscles of the back. The rib cage is made up of two sets of 12 flat, curved bones which originate from the dorsal vertebrae. These sweep down and around and attach to the sternum in the front. Finally, the pelvis is comprised of two mirrored, irregular-shaped hip bones, which buttress the sacrum and attach to each other in the front. As we saw in the previous section, the head sits atop the spinal column, and while this may look precarious viewing only the skeleton, there are really many deep muscles which hold the head erect and allow it to move. The basic movements of the head are forward and back, tilting side to side, and twisting right and left. These muscles work in coordination for continuous movement. For the artist, the important muscles are the sternocleidomastoid muscles in the front and the deep cord-like spinal muscles in the back, as well as the superficial trapezius muscle, which covers the back of the neck, the upper back, and shoulders. The sternocleidomastoid muscle is responsible for turning the head right and left, pulling the head forward, and the lateral inclination of the head. It takes its name from its attachment to the sternum, the clavicle, and the mastoid process just behind the ear. In rotation, it's the right sternocleidomastoid muscle that turns the head to the left, and the left that turns the head to the right. As an artist, you can appreciate the dynamic beauty of this muscle with its strong, short cord-like shape. The muscles of the back counter the sternocleidomastoid by pulling the head back. These thick rope-like muscles and the superficial trapezius fill out the shape of the neck. The trapezius is a diamond-shaped flat muscle which originates with the occipital bone of the skull, the 7th cervical vertebrae, and all 12 thoracic vertebrae. It attaches to the outer third of the clavicle and the length of the ridge or spine of the scapula. On the surface, the back of the neck appears somewhat flattened due to the covering of the trapezius. These muscles also help to tilt the head side to side. Seen from the back, the spinous process of the 7th cervical vertebrae is a landmark visible when the head goes forward. This vertebrae marks the end of the neck. Time and again you'll see how the shape and position of bones affect the muscles and the surface forms of the body. In profile, the curve of the spinal column is reflected in the upward curve of the neck, and the cylindrical shape of the neck corresponds to the rounded shape of the first set of ribs. Artists should be familiar with the thyroid cartilage, which protrudes in front to form the Adam's apple. The human shoulder is a marvelous mechanical device. Because of its design, the arm can achieve a great range of movement, flexibility, and power. Understandably, it's also very complex, employing numerous muscles. The principal bones of the shoulders are the clavicle or collarbones and the scapula or shoulder blades. It's also not unreasonable to consider the humerus as an extension of the shoulder. The clavicle is attached to the sternum of the rib cage, and the shoulder blade is attached to the clavicle. From the anterior view, the clavicle appears straight, but a view from above reveals their true form, sweeping back like a pair of bike handlebars. The scapula is a flat triangular-shaped bone, which features a prominent ridge or spine, the end of which articulates with the clavicle. Together these bones make up the shoulder girdle and should be viewed as a single, highly flexible unit. The scapula doesn't have a hard connection to the body. Rather, it's held in place or embedded by several muscles of the shoulder and back. It's meant to float over the volume of the rib cage, resulting in a gliding fluid movement. With the arm at rest, the long side of the scapula runs parallel to the spinal column. The prominent muscles of the shoulder are the pectoralis, which pulls the arm forward and upward, the trapezius and deltoid, which help to raise the arm laterally and over the head, and the latissimus dorsi, which helps to pull the arm back and down. The pectoralis is a relatively flat muscle, anchored to the clavicle, the length of the sternum, the cartilage of the first 6 ribs, and the lateral portion of the 4th and 5th ribs. As the arm is drawn forward, the pectoralis swells noticeably along its medial and inferior border, which is perceptible in the well-developed male model. In females, this muscle is rarely so well developed and is also covered by breast tissue. The word delta is derived from the Greek, meaning triangular in shape, which is where the deltoid muscle gets its name. It originates in the outer end of the clavicle and the spine of the scapula. It tapers as it descends to insert in the upper outside face of the humerus, sort of wedging itself in between the bicep and the tricep muscles of the arm. As it reaches the horizontal, the deltoid achieves its distinctive rounded shape. It also helps to pull the arm forward and backward. Above the horizon, the trapezius and pectoralis muscles raise the arm over the head. This is one of the most intriguing mechanical aspects of the scapula. When the humerus reaches the horizontal level, its vertical movement is limited by the scapula. So, to raise the arm up and over the head, the scapula pivots, allowing the trapezius and pectoralis to pull the arm upward. The latissimus dorsi is a large, flat muscle that covers most of the lower back. It looks similar to an abbreviated tank top. It starts from the lower 6 thoracic vertebrae, the lumbar vertebrae, and the sacrum, and inserts in the upper inside face of the humerus. Its purpose is to pull the arm down and back. Most of the latissimus dorsi is relatively flat and has little influence on the surface form of the back. It's most noticeable as it crosses the rib cage and attaches to the humerus. There are several other small muscles that control the arm. Most notable are the muscles located on the scapula, that being infraspinatus, teres minor, and teres major. These muscles work to pull the arm backward and to rotate the arm in its socket. Other muscles in turn act upon the scapula. These are the rhomboid and levator scapula that work to pull the scapula back toward the median line and up. There are several notable features of the shoulder that's of interest to artists. Between the trapezius muscle and the clavicle bone, there's a recess. This landmark becomes more pronounced as the shoulder is drawn forward and up. Another landmark is the acromion process of the scapula, a bony canopy over the ball and socket joint of the shoulder. As the arm is raised, a depression or notch is formed where the trapezius and deltoid muscles meet. Under the shoulder, the recess of the armpit is formed by the space between the pectoralis muscles and the muscles of the back. While there are several muscles associated with the elbow is in fact restricted to one basic hinge-type movement, raising and lowering the forearm. The bones associated with the elbow are the humerus above the joint and the radius and ulna below. The upper end of the humerus, as we described, consists of a ball head which fits into the shoulder socket of the scapula. The lower end appears flat in profile. From the front, it's shaped to accommodate the ulna and radius. The humerus articulates with the ulna via a spool-like contrivance called the trochlea. At the upper end of the ulna, the olecranon hooks and rotates around the trochlea. This rotation is limited by an indentation in the back of the humerus called the olecranon fossa. Parallel to the ulna is the radius. Notice how the ulna is larger where it articulates with the humerus and tapers as it descends to the wrist. In contrast, the radius bone connects with the humerus via a small ball and socket joint and gets progressively larger where it connects with the wrist. Raising or flexing the arm is the job of two muscles, the better-known bicep and the lesser-known brachialis. The body of the bicep muscle rests midway on the front of the humerus. It's attached at the upper end to the scapula. Below, the muscle and its tendon attaches to the radius bone. Just beneath the bicep is the brachialis muscle. As these two muscles contract, the lower arm is lifted. The bicep has a large influence on the shape of the arm. In flexion, it takes on a globular shape. By contrast, the tricep on the back of the arm is responsible for straightening or extending the arm. In repose, this muscle is elongated. But as the arm straightens or extends, its appearance is marked by this unique V-shaped notch. The tricep takes its name from its three heads, which originate on the humerus and the edge of the scapula. The tricep tapers to a connective tendon that inserts into the olecranon of the ulna, which is also considered the point of the elbow. A significant landmark of the arm is the medial epicondyle of the humerus, evident when the arm is lowered, palms facing forward. Just as the upper arm is dedicated to raising and lowering the forearm or lower arm in turn is essentially responsible for the movements of the wrist, hand, and fingers. The dexterity and motor skills of the hand and wrist is the result of a complex group of bones, muscles, and tendons. To begin, the lower arm is composed of two bones, the radius and ulna. As we saw previously, the ulna, along with the humerus, make up the elbow joint. Located next to the ulna is the radius. Notice how the ulna is larger where it articulates with the humerus and tapers as it descends to the wrist. In contrast, the radius bone connects with the humerus by way of a small ball and socket joint and gets progressively larger where it connects with the wrist. A fascinating aspect of the radius bone is how it pivots on its articulation with the humerus, which results in turning the wrist. When the palm is facing forward, the radius and ulna are parallel to each other. This is referred to as the supine position. When the wrist turns over toward the body, the radius spins and crosses over the ulna. This rotation inward is called pronation. The act of turning the wrist back to the supine position is called supination. The two muscles involved with turning the wrist are the pronator teres and the supinator muscle. The pronator teres is a short muscle that originates at the inner condyle of the humerus. It follows a diagonal path across the ulna and inserts in the upper outer surface of the radius. As it contracts, it pulls and rotates the radius bone. In total, the wrist rotates about 180 degrees. In opposition, the supinator is a long, fleshy muscle which originates at the outer condyle of the humerus. It descends past the elbow joint while it tapers and inserts at the styloid process of the radius. It's responsible for turning the lower arm back to the supine position. Also originating from the inner and outer condyles are the flexor and extensor muscles of the hand and wrist. The flexors are a group of smaller muscles that start at the inner condyle of the humerus. These muscles descend down the arm and taper as they cross the wrist and radiate across the hand and fingers. There are several other deep flexor muscles of the forearm that fill out the arm but don't influence the shape as significantly. The flexors are responsible for drawing or bending the hand and fingers in toward the body. On the back of the forearm, there is a second but smaller group, which are the extensors. These muscles originate at the outer condyle of the humerus, just above the elbow. As they descend, their tendons radiate over the back of the hand. In contrast, the extensors straighten the hand, including the wrist, palm, and fingers. The artist may actually find difficulty visualizing and rendering the lower arm, and not just because of the number of muscles. As the lower arm rotates, the associated muscles also twist. For instance, here's a depiction of the lower arm. In the supine position, the muscles of the arm run relatively parallel down to the hands and fingers. But as the wrist turns or pronates, the muscles twist with it. The bones of the hand are divided into three segments: the carpal or wrist bones, the metacarpal, or the bones of the palm, and the flanges, which are the bones of the fingers. 8 small bones make up the wrist. The overall shape of the wrist is convex on the back and concave on the palmar side. The metacarpal bones number 5, corresponding to the fingers and the thumb. The thumb has only 2 flanges, while each finger has 3. Each flange decreases in size from the metacarpals to the ends of the fingers. The joints between the flanges and the flanges in the metacarpal bones are referred to as knuckles, and these joints are quite evident when the hand forms a fist. The movements of the hand are classified as flexion and extension of the fingers and flexion and extension of the wrist. The fingers spread and close by small muscles called the interossi, located on either side of the fingers. The abductor pollicis longus is responsible for the abduction of the hand at the wrist. And the flexor carpi ulnaris serves as the flexor and adductor of the hand. The palm of the hand is generously padded, acting as a cushion, molding its surface to hold objects and tools. The center of the palm is slightly concave, with numerous creases running perpendicular to the natural direction of the fingers. There are also transverse creases between each flange. There is a fleshy mound at the base of the thumb, a muscle called the thenar eminence, and is most visible as the thumb flexes on the palm. The back of the hand is less fleshy, with bones, tendons, and veins quite prominent when the hand is extended. The styloid process of the ulna marks the level at which the lower arm connects with the wrist. The midsection of the body controls the larger movements of the torso. This section of the body can further be divided into 3 sections: the abdomen in front, the loins or lower back, and the flanks on the sides. These muscles are more highly developed on the human than other 4-legged mammals. That's because these muscles are responsible for raising and keeping man erect on 2 feet. Bridging the gap between the ribs and the pelvis is the rectus abdominis, or the abdomen. It's a wide band of muscles situated on both sides of the median line, which tapers as it descends from the 5th, 6th, and 7th ribs to the pubis symphysis of the pelvis. These muscles are not flat but are gently furrowed into 3 sections between the navel and the pectoral muscles. They're quite visible on the lean muscular model, what bodybuilders like to call their six-pack. They're responsible for pulling the upper torso forward and are very distinctive as the muscles contract. There are several deep layers of muscles running up and down the back, weaving among and attaching to the vertebrae. But the defining muscle group of the lower back is the erector spinae. Their appearance is like 2 thick cords running up the back on both sides of the spinal column, creating a valley or channel between them. On the flayed model, these muscles are hidden under the latissimus dorsi and the trapezius muscles. The erector spinae are anchored to the sacrum, the lumbar and lower thoracic vertebrae, and attached to the back ribs and the occipital bone of the skull. They pull the back up to the vertical. On the flanks are the external obliques. These muscles attach to the iliac crest and the inguinal ligament and connect above with the lower 8 ribs. The external obliques are responsible for bending side to side and twisting right and left. Like the sternocleidomastoid muscle, it's the right oblique that turns the torso left, and vice versa. In addition to keeping the figure erect, the abdominal and the muscles of the back and sides allow the figure to bend forward and backward. With a limber subject, the body can almost sandwich itself in half. Bending backward, the body is limited by the design of the spine. Because of its position between the upper and lower body, the pelvis can be viewed as the body's axis. The pelvis bones are very irregular in shape and hard to visualize at first. The pelvis is composed of two mirrored hip bones and the sacrum, which serves as the keystone joining the two hip bones. The sacrum is at the lower end of the spinal column, and the coccyx, or tailbone, is further attached to the sacrum. From the front view, the hip bones form a basin, into which fit the lower organs. Each hip bone is distinguished by a prominent rounded ridge called the iliac crest. This ridge descends to the sacrum, and the hip bones are angled backward. At the upper extremity, the iliac crest flares out to form a hollow, which is filled by the muscles situated on the pelvis. On the lateral surface is a large cup-like socket, much larger and deeper than the socket of the shoulder joint. The prominent head of the femur, or thigh bone, fits into this socket. The ball of the femur is connected to the larger bone via a short shaft, called the neck. At the junction of the shaft and the longer bone is the great trochanter, a large bony knob, which is always visible on the model. Located on the lower extremity of the pelvis is a bony form called the symphysis pubis. As illustrated earlier, this is where the rectus abdominis and lateral oblique connect. Below this are the pubic arches, which form two separate holes. These arches form an attachment for the adductor muscles on the inside of the thigh. The major muscles situated on the pelvis are the gluteus medius, the gluteus maximus, and the tensor fascia, three thick muscles which give the pelvic region its fleshy appearance. The gluteus medius descends from its connection on the iliac crest and covers the great trochanter. The gluteus medius causes the abduction of the femur and its rotary motion. To the back is the gluteus maximus. This well-rounded muscle is the largest muscle of the body. It originates from the back of the iliac crest and the sacrum and sweeps down and outward, attaching to the back of the femur. The gluteus maximus helps to support the pelvis and acts as an extensor for the femur by pulling the leg backward. There's a deep crevice formed where the two gluteus maximus muscles meet. There's often a fold at the lower extremity where the gluteus maximus meets the muscles of the back of the leg, especially noticeable when one leg acts as the weight-bearing leg. In the front of the pelvis, next to the gluteus medius, is the tensor fascia. Though relatively short, because of its location, it's always evident. Originating from the iliac crest, it descends and attaches to the front of the femur, just below the great trochanter. This muscle acts as a flexor, pulling the thigh up to the hip. It also works to rotate the thigh inward. There are other muscles that attach to the pelvis, but these have less influence on the shape and surface forms. Those muscles will be discussed in further detail in the next section. The noteworthy landmarks of the pelvis are the surface forms of the iliac crest and the great trochanter. There are also two indentations called the superior lateral lumbar fossets, also termed the dimples of Venus. These indentations mark the attachment of the sacrum to the pelvis. The legs are the support columns of the upper body. and are substantially thick and muscular to support this weight. The general shape of the thigh is cylindrical, tapering in size as it descends to the knee. The femur or thigh bone is the longest bone in the body and is angled inward from the great trochanter to the knee. The main muscles in the front of the thigh are the rectus femoris, the vastus externus, and the vastus internus. The rectus femoris originates at the lower anterior portion of the iliac crest and ends just above the knee. The vastus externus and vastus internus start at the upper end of the femur, descend on either side of the rectus femoris, and end just above the knee. The teardrop shape of the vastus internus, just to the inside of the knee, is its distinguishing characteristic. These three muscles merge just above the knee to form a common tendon and ligament which passes over the knee and inserts into the tibia bone of the lower leg. This group of muscles are responsible for the extension or straightening of the lower leg. The sartorius is the longest muscle in the body. It descends between the rectus femoris and the vastus internus before it cuts across the vastus internus, then moves around to the inside of the kneecap before terminating just below the knee to the tibia. It's a muscle clearly visible to the practiced observer. The sartorius is responsible for flexing the leg on the hip, flexing the lower leg at the knee, and the outward rotation of the leg. Viewing the thigh from the back, the major muscles can be classified as the hamstrings. The hamstrings are composed of two long muscles, the semitendinous and the bicep femoris, which originate at the ischial tuberosity of the pelvis just below the gluteus maximus. These muscles insert via tendons that pass laterally on either side of the knee, attaching to the tibia and the fibula below the knee. These muscles are responsible for bending or flexing the lower leg. Additionally, they pull and straighten the leg during the act of walking or running. To the inside of the sartorius are a series of adductor muscles, which pull the leg toward the median line. These muscles complete the cylindrical appearance of the leg. As the knee bends, the hamstring tendons form a hollow at the back of the knee, called the popliteal space. Like the elbow, the knee is more or less a hinge joint, with the single function of bending the knee. The knee joint is formed by the articulation of the condyles of the femur and the tibia. Anteriorly, a small recess is formed where these bones meet, where you'll find the patella, or the kneecap. The patella protects the knee joint and acts as a pulley, providing leverage for the muscles to straighten the leg. The joint of the knee is bony and tendinous, and more box-like. It's held together by the ligaments and tendons that surround and crisscross the joint, holding it firmly in alignment. Just below the patella is a transverse fatty pad. With the leg straightened, the bony prominences of the knee are very apparent. On the side view, we see the kneecap in profile. This is the tendon of the fascia latae. Here, the back of the knee joint is obscured by the calf muscle, which inserts into the femur above the knee. When the knee bends, the front becomes smooth and rounded. Well, here we are at the last leg, so to speak, of our survey of the human form. Just as the lower arm is tied to the movements of the hand, the lower leg is dedicated to the movements of the foot. The bones of the lower leg are the tibia and fibula. The tibia is the larger prominent bone. At its upper extremity, it meets the femur to form the knee joint. At its lower end, it rests on the talus of the foot to form the ankle joint. The tibia is unique in that most of its anterior length can be seen and felt just below the skin. To the outside is the thinner fibula bone, which adds support and stability. The larger muscles of the lower leg include the tibialis anterior, which is responsible for flexing the foot on the leg. The tibialis anterior also helps to raise the inside of the foot. This muscle originates at the upper two-thirds of the tibia and ends at the base of the first metatarsal. This muscle is most evident during walking and running. On the back of the leg is the gastrocnemius, or calf muscle. When flexed, the two heads of this muscle create the distinctive inverted V-shaped notch. Originating from the internal and external condyles of the femur, the gastrocnemius connects, by way of the Achilles tendon, to lift the heel bone. When raising the heel, the body's center of gravity shifts forward, creating forward motion. Beneath the gastrocnemius is the soleus, which is also dedicated to raising the heel. Together, these muscles fill out the larger profile of the lower leg. In addition, the other muscles of the lower leg act as flexors and extensors of the foot. The movements of the foot include flexion and extension of the toes, inversion and eversion, and elevation of the inner and outer borders of the foot. Smaller muscles allow for the abduction and adduction of the toes. The bones of the hand and foot are similar in arrangement. The bones that comprise the foot include the tarsal or heel bones, which include the talus, upon which rests the weight of the entire body, the calcaneus, the navicular, cuneiforms 1, 2, and 3, and the cuboid. The tarsal bones are related to the carpal or wrist bones of the hand. There are 5 metatarsal bones, which form the instep, and can be equated to the metacarpal bones of the palm. And finally, there are the phalanges, or bones of the toes, which number 2 for the big toe, and 3 each for the other 4 smaller toes. Because of the structure of the foot, its range of motion and flexibility is limited compared to that of the hand. The bones of the foot are arranged to form 3 arches. 2 of these stretch lengthwise from the heel to the ball of the foot. These arches can be seen clearly from the inside of the foot and less so from the outside. The 3rd arch runs transversely along the balls of the foot. These arches provide a natural spring and elasticity when walking or running, and serve as effective shock absorbers. Like the back of the hand, the top of the foot is bony and tendinous, especially when the foot flexes. The sole, or bottom of the foot, is fleshy and padded. The overall shape of the foot is that of a wedge from the outside in and from front to back. At the ankle joint, the prominent protrusions of the tibia and fibula can be seen, the tibia being positioned higher toward the inside of the leg and the fibula to the outside.